Hello everyone, and welcome back to yet another video. So it's no secret that topical anti-androgens have had a mixed success rate. Even when we look at RU58841, also known as PSK3841, we can see that the initial phase 1 and 2 human clinical trials gave indications that the drug itself works when it comes to improving hair counts and is somewhat tolerable. We at least see the mentionings of which on Prostrakin's archived website. I should remind you all in the audience that Prostrakin, a now incorporated United Kingdom-based pharmaceutical company, which actually used to be two separate pharmaceutical companies called Proscilia and Strakin, obtained the rights to RU58841 after a series of pharmaceutical company mergers and acquisitions. Finally, Prostrakin was acquired by Kyowa Kirin, a Japanese pharmaceutical company. Anyway, with that lore out of the way, let's have a look at that Prostrakin website on archive.org where they mention RU58841. So archive.org allows us to see the old cached web pages of a particular website. So if you were to go to prostrakin.com, it'll just redirect you to Kyowa Kirin's website. But with this particular tool, we're allowed to look around and see what was going on in the early to mid 2000s. So under their research and development page, Prostrakin mentions about RU58841, which mind you is called PSK3841, they're the same molecule. They mention that
this is an innovative molecule with a unique mechanism of action for the treatment of androgen-dependent conditions, such as androgenetic alopecia and acne. In preclinical studies, it has shown promising activity in various models of acne, alopecia, and hirsutism. The product, PSK3841, also known as RU58841, has good systemic and dermal tolerance. In human clinical pharmacology, there was no systemic anti-androgenic activity, and again good general and dermal tolerance. The molecule has completed several phase 1 studies and a proof-of-concept phase 2 study for alopecia. It has demonstrated similar efficacy after 6 months treatment, as that observed with current oral therapy for alopecia after 12 months, based on the increase in net hair count. Again, no systemic anti-androgenic effect was observed, N90. This product is available for licensing.
in addition to these details about the phase 1 and phase 2 human clinical trials, there are multiple studies on RU58841 and also anecdotes online that shows improvements in treating androgenetic alopecia. One particular animal model that I found interesting was the test of RU58841 on stump-tailed macaque monkeys. And these monkeys are our closest evolutionary animal relative that can experience androgenetic alopecia. So they're hominids, we're hominids, and it serves as a very comparable animal study that can show us what will happen if we block androgen receptors in the scalp and how that is able to combat androgenetic alopecia. So in that particular study, improvements were made in the target area hair count for those stump-tailed balding macaque monkeys. So that's just an additional bit of evidence of RU58841 working. So we have some details, some loose details about it working in humans, phase 1, phase 2, and also it working in stump-tailed rhesus macaque monkeys, our closest animal relative that can experience androgenetic alopecia. Okay, so this is cool and all, but this begs the question, why isn't RU58841 on the market right now? After all, it's been around for nearly 2 decades on the gray market, but if it was successful in phase 1 and phase 2 human clinical trials, then why didn't we get a phase 3 human clinical trial? Why aren't we getting RU58841 gel to treat our acne and or androgenetic alopecia from our dermatologists? Why doesn't RU58841 have some sort of fancy drug brand name like finasteride does with Propecia, or dutasteride does with Avodart? Come to think of it, let's think of a cool name for RU58841. I'm thinking Vitressa. So I'm having a bit of fun here, Vitressa, because the VIT, vit, can be thought of like life or vitality, from Latin vita, res, R-E-S-S. So tress, and like we know tressless, the word tress means a lock of hair. So yeah, that's just me fooling around. But anyway, let's get back to the topic here. It's important for us to ask the question, why didn't RU58841 come to market? That is the essential question here, because it's very hard to find any sort of public details on the human clinical trials. Like, We can't find the papers. Believe me, I tried to find the papers. I literally drove to Kirin's pharmaceutical base here in New Jersey, and I sent a bunch of emails, and they pretty much gave me vague responses, nothing of substantial detail here. But I think I have some details for you guys. In a previous video, I investigated RE58841. From my research, it seems that due to financial reasons being the most likely case here, Prostrakin dropped the development of RE58841 in favor of their transdermal, first-of-its-kind, topical androgen. This medication was called Testosterone gel, and it went on to gain billions for Prostrakin during a time where the pharmaceutical company was having some debt issues. In fact, Prostrakin mentions this particular drug in their R&D pipeline under the section of male HRT, if you check the Wayback Machine link on the archive website.
Normal androgen, testosterone and dihydrotestosterone levels are important for bone and muscle mass, strength, cognition, sexual function, and general sense of well-being in men. It is well known that androgen levels decrease with age. So, with an aging population, androgen replacement therapy is becoming increasingly important. When taken by mouth, androgens are very quickly destroyed by the liver. This issue has been overcome by the introduction of more acceptable dermally applied gels. However, the ideal goal remains a safe and consistently effective oral androgen replacement therapy. Androgen replacement also has potential uses in male contraception, various muscle-wasting diseases, and certain aspects of female sexual dysfunction.
Fortunately for Prostrakin, they would eventually get the United States of America's FDA, the Food and Drug Administration's, approval for their topical androgen gel for the treatment of low testosterone men, also known as hypogonadism. Shortly after, Kirin, the Japanese pharmaceutical company that I mentioned earlier, would offer to buy out Prostrakin and incorporate it as a subsidiary under its pharmaceutical multinational umbrella as Kyowa Kirin International. For what it's worth, someone on Reddit supposedly contacted a researcher on the clinical trials for RU58841, and this researcher essentially said the same thing. And we can see that around this time, Prostrakin was having some money issues, as noted by these articles on the screen here. Furthermore, another Reddit user named Burgie made a detailed documentation of Prostrakin's research and development plan. They were able to uncover, in some paywalled articles, that Prostrakin mentions that they did see value in continuing RU58841, also known as PSK3841, along with other drugs in their research pipeline. This included an estradiol patch for women, so a female hormone replacement therapy for women who have low estrogen. However, they simply did not have these drugs as a priority. This is what Prostrakin apparently stated. And Burgie goes on to document how Prostrakin essentially dropped these drugs. RU58841, also known as PSK3841, the estradiol patch for women, and some others that aren't really important for us to consider. So, again, Prostrakin didn't have these drugs as a priority, although they saw some value in it. So everyone who says that there's no way, if this thing actually worked, they would have brought it to market, that's not particularly the case here. Money is a motivating factor, and some markets are just bigger than hair loss, believe it or not. And if you're a good pharmaceutical company, but at the same time you have limited funds because of your investors, you need to prioritize your money in places that you know you're going to get more success. And for Prostrakin, that was their Fortesta treatment for hypogonadism, or men who have low testosterone. And it served them well enough to solve their financial troubles and get bought out by a pretty large pharmaceutical company from Japan. Now, finally, for myself, I was able to talk to a researcher through LinkedIn who was doing clinical trials for Prostrakin at the time, and they also mentioned that the money was spread thin between two projects. That project being that male hormone replacement gel and the topical anti-androgen RU58841, also known as PSK3841. Now, that's my word for what it's worth, so hopefully that means something. I'm not going to dox this particular person that I was talking to because they told this to me in confidence, so That's just not something I'm going to do here. But again, that being said, we don't have the full human clinical trials publicly available on RU58841. So we can't say how much of the hair counts improved by for the humans, or if there were any strange side effects. And when you go on the internet and you read some of the posts, there seems to be some strange side effects regarding this particular topical anti-androgen. So let's explore that and see what's going on here.
RU58841, my experience, after 2 different symptomatic episodes.
What a waste of good are you?
It's really crazy to me how some dudes take it for years without any problems, and others are getting heart attack symptoms within days.
That's why I tried it again. I was literally thinking last time I ended up being sick after a few days of chest pain, maybe I got COVID. I tried it again and got way worse symptoms this round. I don't get symptoms to any dutasteride, finasteride, low-level laser therapy, minoxidil, or dermarolling.
Now, I've noticed as of late that more people are complaining about heart palpitations and or chest pain tightness issues from using RU58841 received from gray market vendors on the internet. Now, to be fair, RU58841 heart issues or respiratory complaint issues have been mentioned for some time on the internet. It should be noted that metabolites of RU58841, 2 of which include cyanonilutamide and nilutamide. These 2 anti-androgens, when taken orally or at least exposed systemically, have been known to have some pretty drastic effects on androgenic activity, such that it suppresses it. It is unknown how much of RU58841 is needed to go systemic to cause issues with, say, libido, or even worse, potential issues with the cardiovascular system. And this is even if RU58841 is directly responsible. Again, it could very well be its metabolites, which would require for RU58841 to chemically break down into them in the body. Nilutamide, the metabolite of RU58841 that I mentioned, is known to have a potential side effect of lung disease. So this is where things get a little bit worrying. The literature is sparse, but there is some evidence for this. For instance, the case report titled, quote, simultaneously liver and lung toxicity related to non-steroidal anti-androgen nilutamide, also known as Anandrin, a case report, unquote, by Dr. Jose Luis Gomez et al., 1992, follows a 69-year-old prostate cancer patient who developed simultaneous liver dysfunction and interstitial lung disease after treatment with nilutamide. Symptoms and abnormal test results appeared 2 months into the treatment, leading to cessation of anadron, which resulted in significant improvement. This case highlights reversible lung and liver toxicity associated with nilutamide in the context of hormone therapy for prostate cancer. But still, it is very worrying that RU58841 does have this particular metabolite, and the fact that people are complaining about chest pain issues, I can see the concern here, and it's very valid because we just don't have the public human clinical data on RU58841, and we don't even know the proper ways to compound it to limit systemic exposure. Mind you, there are people on the internet who are using absurd amounts, very, very high concentrations of RU58841, going all the way up to 10%. I think I saw one desperate guy going to 15% RU58841 topically. And what we know with fixed law concentration, that when you increase the concentration on a particular surface of a particular molecule, right, that causes more of the molecule to penetrate that surface, at least in the context of dermatology. So people, if you're using RU58841, which I'm not going to sit here and tell you to do that, first off, this is your risk. You should do the research. And second, don't go to a high concentration. 5, maybe 8%, I wouldn't push past that because you could get even more systemic absorption that could just wreak havoc on you. Next, we're actually going to look at an animal study involving rats. And I know, we're not rats, we're human beings. At least most of us, I hope. Maybe we have some aliens or some fish watching in the audience. But we're going to look at this animal model study just to see what nilutamide could possibly do. The research paper titled, quote, Generation of Free Radicals During the Reductive Metabolism of Nilutamide by Lung Microsomes, Possible Role in Development of Lung Lesions in Patients Treated with This Anti-Androgen, unquote, by Berger et al., 1992, utilized an animal model with rat lung microsomes to delve into the metabolism of nilutamide, a drug associated with pulmonary toxicity. While acknowledging that this is an animal model and the direct applicability to humans may have limitations, the findings do indeed provide significant insights. Under anaerobic conditions, nilutamide is reduced to a nitroanion free radical, a process not inhibited by cytochrome P450 inhibitors, but significantly reduced by inhibitors of NADPH cytochrome P450 reductase. Conversely, under aerobic conditions, the nitroanion free radical undergoes redox cycling, resulting in the generation of a reactive oxygen species instead of covalent binding. So what does all that hocus pocus science smience type of speech mean? Well, this suggests that when nilutamide is metabolized further, at least in the rat lung microsomes, it produces toxic species, potentially explaining the lung disease that occurs in patients treated with this anti-androgen. Okay, so let's be clear about what is going on here. So for the laymen in the audience, reactive oxygen species, or ROS, are molecules that contain oxygen and are highly reactive due to the presence of unpaired electrons. In a more technical sense, these unpaired electrons make ROS, the reactive oxygen species, very unstable, and they seek stability by reacting with other molecules within the cells, such as DNA, protein, and lipids, potentially causing cellular damage. This process, which I'm sure many of you have heard this by now, is called oxidative stress. The body naturally produces ROS during various metabolic processes, especially with the mitochondria, the cell's powerhouse, as many of you guys know it as, and as a byproduct of energy production. Oxygen reactive species can play dual roles in the body. At low or moderate levels, they are vital in cellular signaling and the defense mechanisms, helping to fight off infections and regulate cell growth. However, when their production overwhelms the body's antioxidant defenses, and these are molecules that neutralize the reactive oxygen species by donating electrons to stabilize them, oxidative stress occurs, leading to cellular damage and contributing to various diseases and just the typical aging process. So the term toxic species here refers to any molecule that can cause harm to the body, including reactive oxygen species that are in high concentrations. We also have other species that are reactive nitrogen species, or RNS, and these molecules can become toxic when their levels exceed the body's natural capacity to detoxify them or repair their resulting damages. In the context of nilutamide metabolism, the anti-androgen that we've been talking about, this byproduct of RU58841, the drug undergoes a reduction process in the lungs, generating a nitron anion free radical, a specific type of reactive species. This radical can then participate in a oxidation reduction cycle under aerobic conditions. And aerobic means the presence of oxygen, and your lungs has a lot of oxygen, right? So it's kind of weird. The more you breathe, the more you introduce oxygen, and the higher the concentration of nilutamide is around your lungs, the more damage it causes to your lungs. This is why this particular anti-androgen is just really, really toxic. And if this indeed is the reason why people complain about chest pains, well, one, thankfully people aren't getting lung disease, or at least there hasn't been that much anecdotal evidence that has come out about people getting lung disease from RU58841. But the intricate damage that is caused potentially by this particular metabolite by RU58841, nilutamide, could be a potential reason why people are complaining about tightness in their chest or some sort of weird chest or heart pain. I don't think it's your heart muscle per se that's going through some sort of oxidative stress here, because realistically, you would have been dead. You probably wouldn't be watching this video by now. So if it is, right, if these manufacturers are producing RU58841 so-called solutions, there could be the instance that during their manufacturing process, the production process, that they're getting a lot of these particular metabolites, right? Because even if you just leave RU58841 there for about a year or two, it can denature and turn into these particular metabolites, which could be pretty dangerous. There isn't that much in the medical literature about RU58841 and its potential damages, if it causes any at all, because we don't have those public phase 1, phase 2 human clinical trial data out in the public, right? Nobody knows what actually happened in regards to side effects. The stump-tail macaca monkeys, they didn't exhibit any sort of anti-androgenic effects in their bodies, and they didn't seem to have any sort of weird blood work or any sort of indication that their lungs were failing. Now, if you're using a high concentration of RU58841, or if you're, obsessively applying that to your scalp, maybe on that off chance, you could be introducing more of nilutamide and other RU58841 metabolites to your body, and that's probably why people are having these side effects. And also, it could be people are having nocebo effects, right? Maybe some of these manufacturers are also including high concentrations of minoxidil into their RU58841 solutions, which could be causing some sort of, cardiovascular issue. But from my perspective, there's probably some compounding errors that are occurring, which are causing the metabolites to be readily available, or at least more so in some people, to cause these particular chest pains. So if you can't accept the risk, don't even mess with RU58841, or really any experimentals for that matter. Only if you're educated and if you're willing to take the risk and do your own research about it, that's on you. But I'm not going to say go do that. But in terms and efficacy, I would say that RU58841 has a positive impact in shielding the hair follicle from DHT. When it comes to hair count improvements in humans, as noted by Prostrakin in their archived website, for the phase 1 and phase 2 human clinical trials, RU58841 apparently has comparable benefits to oral drugs like finasteride and dutasteride. But like with other clinical topical anti-androgens under research, it could very well be ineffective on its own in the long term. So we're going to actually look at that in the next section. The more modern topical anti-androgens, some that are on the market, at least the one that's on the market that I'm thinking of, which is CB0301 or Castration, and another one that's in clinical trials, which is pyrilutamide or KX826. So let's move on to that next section. Recently, the KX826 pyrilutamide 0.5% phase 3 clinical trial in China, conducted by Kintor Pharma, resulted in a significant setback as the drug demonstrated no statistical superiority over placebo in increasing hair count. This outcome was particularly unexpected given that the previous phase 2 trials in China for KX826 pyrilutamide had shown a statistically significant improvement in hair count with KX826 at both a 0.5% and a 0.2% concentrations, with 0.5% demonstrating greater efficacy over placebo. The failure in phase 3 contrasts sharply with these earlier results, necessitating a re-evaluation of KX826 formulation, dosage, or administration strategy. The issue might be attributed to the drug's high molecular weight, and also the challenges associated with skin absorption, suggesting that the higher concentration could potentially enhance its efficacy. But one thing must be noted, right? If we go with a higher concentration with KX826 pyrilutamide, we do run the risk of exposing the body to more of this very strong anti-androgen, right? It has a IC50 of 0.28 nanomolar, meaning it's very, very effective at small quantities at blocking the androgen receptor. So the lower the IC50 score is, the more effective that particular drug is at doing what it's supposed to do, right? If that makes sense. So KX826, both in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, came out with a very safe profile. Essentially, nobody had any sort of systemic hormones messed with, and the most common complaint was agitation at the site of application, which is primarily due to the contact dermatitis from whatever carrier that they're using. So it could be the alcohol in their solution that they're doing in the clinical trials, or it could be the propylene glycol that they may have. It could be a variety of things. But increasing that concentration could potentially have side effects. But that's something that has to be experimented with. I had some hard asses in some of the Discord servers state to me like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. They've already tested this in phase 1. Look at this particular graph over here. This graph says that 3 milligram, 12 milligram, and 48 milligram, you're getting this much systemic exposure. and it could cause side effects, but you have to take into account the fact that at 3 milligram, 12 milligram, and 48 milligram, the researchers didn't notice any sort of suppression of androgenic activity in the body. So I don't know what these people are talking about who seem to have this sort of criticism of me. Perhaps you need a particular load or amount of the drug to trigger that sort of side effect, but we know that finasteride and dutasteride, specifically dutasteride at 2.5 milligram, has side effects, right? So the fact that something has side effects, even if it's in a small amount of people, doesn't necessarily negate it from getting clinical approval. I hope people can understand that point. So long as those side effects go away at some point during treatment and they're not prolonged after treatment and they don't cause any permanent disfiguration, then yes, that particular drug, kwxsoc, at a higher concentration, if it doesn't have those sort of side effects or those sort of issues that I enumerated on, it can be on the market. So screw you to that particular person who just is so annoying. I know some people watching this may not know what I'm talking about, but I just have some people who like to rage on about the things that I say. Now, if we turn over to Castration or CB0301, another topical anti-androgen developed for androgenetic alopecia, it showed promising results in phase 2 trials with notable improvements in total hair count across various concentrations. However, subsequent results revealed a decline in hair counts from 6-month mark to the 12-month mark. So that means this thing was having really good statistical improvement between month 1 to month 6, right? When researchers were using topical CB0301 or Castration to fight androgenetic alopecia, male pattern baldness. But for some reason, the hair counts began to decline. And this was unexpected in the latter half of the phase 2 clinical trial. This decline suggests a potential efficacy issue over the long term, which casts doubt on the sustained effectiveness of topical anti-androgens like CB0301, Castration in treating hair loss. Both kwxsoc pyrolutamide and CB0301 Castration sudden failure in latter clinical phases highlights the complexities and challenges in developing effective topical treatments for androgenetic alopecia. Now, going into this next part, some have speculated about the possibility of testosterone being needed for hair growth, at least to some extent in males. Now, I'm talking about on the scalp, so don't talk about like the beard or anything like that. We're talking about the scalp. So I've entertained this possibility for a bit. A subscriber in my Discord server sent me an interesting study from 1965. So thank you, Daniel, for this study. It's pretty old, but it allows us to entertain the idea of testosterone being needed to grow hair, or at least contributes to its strength on the scalp. Again, we're talking about on the scalp here. So let's see if that's the case. So the paper titled, quote, "Stimulation of Hair Growth by Topical Application of Androgens," unquote, by Christopher M. Papa and Albert M. Kligman focused on the effects of topical application of androgens, specifically testosterone propionate, on hair growth in bald men. Their study stemmed from the previous observation that testosterone propionate could stimulate hair growth in the armpit area and on the forearm when applied topically, though not when administered systemically. The researchers applied testosterone propionate creams to the scalp of 21 men. And this was to investigate the potential for stimulating the hair in that particular area, specifically the bald regions of the scalp. So this study found that approximately 75% of the participants exhibited some degree of hair regrowth on the scalp, indicating that topical application of androgens, specifically testosterone propionate, could be a promising approach for treating male pattern baldness by promoting growth of longer, thicker, and more pigmented hairs in the bald areas. This supposed regrowth, and I say supposed because we'll look at what actually went on later on, but it was characterized by hairs that were longer, thicker, and more pigmented than in the previously bald areas. So from this outcome, the researchers concluded that it's likely that testosterone and other androgens, right, and this was before a time they actually looked into DHT, but they supposed that testosterone could stimulate hair follicles to create just, in general, stronger hairs. Now, this, again, is intriguing because we know with recent advancements, right, this is a very, very old study, but with recent advancements, we know that testosterone, maybe not it in particular, but when it turns into DHT, dihydrotestosterone, that is the primary factor in progressing male pattern baldness, also known as androgenetic alopecia, which men and women can get. But I find this to be a bit, weird, because when you look at the study's control mechanisms and you just look at the lack of technology that they had back then, you can kind of see that the hair growth that they're trying to assess, there could be a large degree of subjectivity. So the study's control mechanisms, though present, could have been strengthened by including a placebo group or comparing the testosterone treatment to another active treatment. The sample size of the study was relatively small, with only 21 participants receiving the treatment, limiting the ability to generalize the findings across a broader population. They didn't use any sort of phototrichogram. In fact, all of these assessments in terms of the progress were just made with general global photographic assessment, and when I'm looking at the photos, it doesn't really look that impressive. It's like these guys just grew out their hair. I'll try to see if I can use some AI tools to colorize the photos, but this isn't anything substantial. It's not solid proof of testosterone, propionate, or androgens being used to strengthen hair on the scalp. So for me, I'm not going to go too crazy into this study, but I don't think it's a good study. It does not conclusively show that testosterone, propionate, or androgens make the scalp hair stronger. So this next part is a study that I found pretty interesting. It deals with testosterone and how it may help women who are androgen deficient grow hair on their scalps. This seems to be kind of paradoxical, because we associate androgens, both in men and women, particularly DHT, as the driver of male pattern baldness, female pattern baldness, in general, androgenetic alopecia. So both men and women possess androgens and estrogen receptors within the scalp, illustrating a shared biological foundation for hair growth regulation across the genders. Intriguingly, human development in the womb begins on a common path between men and women, with the initial stages of the embryonic development being essentially female until the activation of the Y chromosome for male fetuses. This eventually triggers male differentiation. But this fundamental process underscores the fact that, despite the divergent paths taken due to genetic and hormonal influences, men and women share similar hair follicle characteristics, to an extent that is. The microenvironment surrounding these follicles and the hormonal signals that govern hair growth and loss differ significantly between the sexes. These differences are largely due to the varying levels of androgens and estrogens in the body and how these hormones interact with their respective receptors in the scalp. The study titled, quote, "Improvement in Scalp Hair Growth in Androgen-Deficient Women Treated with Testosterone, a Questionnaire Study," unquote, published in the British Journal of Dermatology in February 2012, R.L. Glasser et al., offers a compelling challenge to the widely held belief that androgens, particularly testosterone, have a universally negative effect on female scalp hair growth. We know the etiology behind androgenetic alopecia. For the people that have the genetics for it, testosterone gets turned into DHT by way of 5-alpha reductase enzymatic activity in the scalp and peripheral tissues. DHT subsequently attaches to the androgen receptors in the hair follicle, ultimately suppressing them, particularly the Wnt pathway, and causing a whole host of downstream negative effects, which leads to the hair follicle progressively growing thinner and smaller hairs, and also reducing the number of hairs that are produced per follicle. It seems like in women, it tends to be the fact that their patterns of androgenetic alopecia hair loss follows a diffuse pattern, and for men, it has this kind of very rigid pattern where you have temporal recession and some thinning at the crown area. But either can happen in both men and women. It seems to be the case that the pattern in which an individual with androgenetic alopecia loses their hair seems to be some sort of genetic characteristic, kind of like your height, your eye color, etc., etc. So everyone has different patterns, right? But some are more common than others. Anyway, going back to the study, the research sought to evaluate the impact of subcutaneous testosterone therapy on the scalp hair growth among women experiencing symptoms of androgen deficiency. Involving 285 women who had been receiving testosterone treatment for at least a year, the study utilized a survey to gather data on changes in scalp and facial hair before and after therapy. The results showed that 27% of the participants reported hair thinning prior to treatment, with 63% of these women experiencing significant hair regrowth after undergoing testosterone therapy. Notably, none of the participants reported scalp hair loss due to the testosterone therapy, although a significant majority, around 92%, observed an increase in facial hair growth. And I can think, women who are, who want to be feminine presenting, right? We have to be careful what we say here. They probably don't want to have facial hair growth. So let's, for all the ladies who are watching who may be losing hair, don't start taking shots of like Anavar or something. Don't do that. That's not going to look well unless you want to go into bodybuilding, right? So here, the findings suggest that testosterone may exert an anabolic effect on scalp hair growth in androgen-deficient women, a notion that contradicts the prevailing view that testosterone worsens female scalp hair loss. The authors speculate that this positive impact on hair growth may stem from the general anabolic effects of testosterone rather than a direct relationship with androgen levels. Now, they do say that there needs to be further research on the matter, and they also emphasize that there needs to be more objectivity when it comes to assessing the hair regrowth. So this seems to be an instance in the literature where we have testosterone seemingly improving hair quality, but in this case, it's in women, so we can't really generalize that specifically to all women, right? Because it's specifically androgen-deficient women in this case, and we can't say that, men will react the same way, or women who are androgen normal will react the same way. And also, the authors mentioned that they need to be more objective when it comes to assessing the hair quality, right? Because they used a survey where they just asked the participants, hey, how's your hair doing now? Are there any improvements? And who's to say that the improvements are directly due to testosterone? It could be due to just the hair recovering from telogen effluvium or chronic telogen effluvium, where you just start losing and shedding hair, or just some other hair loss condition, right? That probably got better on its own. Now, I think it's more true that for women who use testosterone, they will experience hair growth on their face. So I can see part of the surveys being more valid than other parts of the survey, just because of what we know in the clinical literature. So increasing testosterone, I can only imagine, would have an anabolic effect on body hair for women. So I can sit here and try to find evidence and speculate on the matter if testosterone is beneficial to scalp hair, and if blocking the androgen receptor would cause these hairs in the long term to degrade, but we can just put this to rest with what we already know. And I want to give a special shout out to a subscriber of mine who was able to get this gate-kept study that was from decades ago. So thank you to Wayla in my Discord server, but without further ado, let's get on with the video. The study conducted by James B. Hamilton, published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism in October 1960, presents what is really groundbreaking research on the effects of castration on male pattern baldness, particularly in adolescent and young adult males. Now, we've known for a long time that men who do not have their gonads, their testicles, their balls, right, they don't seem to lose their hair. Hippocrates, who's known as the father of medicine in the West, can even be quoted as saying, quote, eunuchs are not subject to gout, nor do they become bald. Similarly, Aristotle observed that eunuchs don't go bald on top, but he also made the assessment that women do not go bald because they don't produce semen, but we know that women can go bald. So I guess he was just making some sort of general claim. But it is the truth that eunuchs, men who are castrated, whether it's before puberty, right? If it's before puberty, they don't lose their hair. If it's after puberty, the hair loss that they were experiencing kind of stalls. If not, they get some sort of hair regrowth. So this objective study by James B. Hamilton essentially just puts this in a science and conclusively finds that this is the reality. You don't have your balls, you can grow your hair back, or depending on when you cut your balls off, if it's before puberty, then you won't lose your hair. That's a crude way of putting things, and I'm not saying cut your balls off because there are some people who are very impressionable, and YouTube has content creators who make these sorts of content put a disclaimer. So disclaimer here, guys, don't cut off your balls, but let's proceed with what Hamilton found in his study. So by observing 21 males after undergoing castration, Hamilton aimed to explore the role of androgens in the development and progression of male pattern baldness. His findings revealed that after castration, subjects showed no further development or expansion of the bald areas, indicating a significant halt in the progression of male pattern baldness, when compared to their intact counterparts. Men who were castrated before puberty had no visible signs of androgenetic alopecia developing. This research provided a clear link between testicular androgens and male pattern baldness, suggesting that the reduction of the body's androgen levels through castration could effectively prevent or slow down the development of baldness. But here the cure is worse than the disease, so let's take a step back and not do that. But I bring up Hamilton's results because it challenges the notion that if you were to block the androgen receptor and prevent testosterone and other androgens coming in contact with the androgen receptor in the hair follicle, that it could negatively impact the hair quality or result in some sort of long-term weird hair loss that's absent of androgenetic alopecia. So it could be some sort of hair loss condition that is predicated on the hair follicle not getting stimulation via androgen receptor from testosterone or any other androgen besides DHT. But in fact, this study, the Hamilton study, shows that, especially in the case of men who were castrated before puberty, if that was the case, if they needed testosterone, then I'm sure that Hamilton would have pointed out that, wow, the hair quality for these men, it's pretty ass, right? But instead what you see is high quality. These men don't lose hair whatsoever. That is, the men who were castrated in their adolescence, they don't lose their hair. They keep their juvenile hair, and they just pristine hair condition. Even the men who were balding and were subsequently castrated after puberty, they saw some improvement in the bald areas of their scalps. And they didn't see any further progression of androgenetic alopecia. So here, if we really needed testosterone, we would have seen the quality of the hair progressively get worse. Now, we know that there are quality differences between hair from men and hair from women. All you have to do is look up scanning electron microscope photos of male versus female hair. We also know that estrogen elongates the duration of time in which the hair follicle grows a particular hair. That's why women typically have longer hair, and the quality of the hair itself is different. You can also check forums in the literature of people who have the transgender experience, right? People who present as males who undergo hormone replacement therapy to get to a more feminine profile. The quality of their scalp hair changes too. So just to conclude here on this particular point, I don't think testosterone really does much on scalp hair growth. Maybe it has a minimal effect, but completely blocking the androgen receptor such that not even testosterone can frequently bind to it, no, I don't think it's going to cause hair loss by any stretch of the mean, or it's going to reduce the quality of the hair on the scalp. But if there's more evidence to it, I'm happy to change my opinion here. But I think Hamilton's study conclusively shows that, well, I mean, these men didn't have that much testosterone in their body, if any at all. Their hair quality only got better. We predicate our same understandings with the Imperocto-McKinley discovery about men who are deficient in type 2 5-alpha reductase, which causes them to have less DHT in their serum and in their tissues. And what did we see there? These pseudohermaphrodites only had better hair. It's just that over here, they lost their 5-alpha reductase type 2 enzymatic activity. And the Hamilton case, these men got their balls cut off. And I don't want to cut off my balls just to save my hair. So I'd rather target DHT, reduce type 2 or even type 1, both enzymatic activity of 5-alpha reductase. Okay, so now in the last segment, I said essentially that testosterone doesn't seem to be needed to any sort of significant extent when it comes to the quality of the hair from the hair follicle on the scalp, right? That is, if we're blocking the androgen receptor, in the long term, it doesn't seem like testosterone would cause the hair follicle to suddenly shed and produce worse hair. I pretty much came to that conclusion by just going back and looking at the Hamilton study on castration and male pattern baldness, and we see that for men who were castrated before puberty, they never lost their hair, and in men that were castrated after puberty and who had signs of male pattern baldness, those regions, the balding areas, never expanded, and in some cases, it got better over time. This is because as soon as you remove the gonads, the testicles, you're not going to have much testosterone to begin with. And because you're not going to have much testosterone to begin with, regardless if you have the 5-alpha reductase enzymatic activity at a high rate throughout your tissues, there just isn't enough androgen to convert into various other androgen leading to testosterone, which would eventually lead to DHT, which will progress androgenetic alopecia. And castration reduces testosterone by a large degree, so this will make a significant impact. Now, this is going to be a bit of a side note, but I've heard people who say, well, anything that you do to marginally increase your testosterone will destroy your hair or can accelerate the rate in which you lose your hair. Now, I think there needs to be some sort of nuance here. If you're doing something that can supraphysiological, that word is so hard to say, but increase your testosterone levels to the point where it's out of the reference range, where you're twice the high-end normal range, like Derek from More Plates, More Dates in that one video where he was 2,000 nanograms per deciliter, yes, that can have a significant impact on your hair loss to the point where it becomes detrimental. But doing things like regularly working out, getting a good night's sleep, eating healthy that can increase your testosterone levels shouldn't cause it to the point where you're at a crazy high range to the point where you're going to lose your hair. No, that's not going to be the case. But in the case of decreasing testosterone for the sake of preserving your hair, if you chemically castrate yourself, if you physically castrate yourself, yes, you are going to potentially stop your hair loss, pretty much indefinitely stop your hair loss. But that is an extreme measure, just as taking steroids is an extreme measure for your hair, right? On one end, you get the extreme benefit by cutting your balls off. Don't do that. And on the other end, you get the negative of taking gear, steroids, anabolic steroids, and that fucks up your hair. And also eventually messing up your balls too. So I just wanted to point that out there. So why are topical anti-androgens suddenly failing? The sudden failure of topical anti-androgens, particularly evident in the cases of clascoterone, also known as CB0301, Breezula, or cortexolone, during clinical trials, as well as the phase 3 paralitamide Kintor Chinese clinical trials, these have all raised concerns. Going to the clascoterone clinical trial, particularly for androgenetic alopecia, we already know that when it comes to acne, clascoterone is FDA approved and it's an effective treatment. But in the hair loss context, this drug has faced some weird results. So the phase 2 clinical trial that was conducted by Cosmo Pharmaceuticals, previously known as Cassiopeia, had clascoterone for male pattern baldness or androgenetic alopecia being developed under the brand name Breezula. And what we saw in phase 2 was that initially there were some positive results within the first 6 months. The phase 2 trial also had various doses of clascoterone showing significant increases in hair count compared to placebo. Specifically, at a 2.5% concentration applied twice daily, it showed a mean increase of 10.2 hairs, indicating a significant difference from the placebo. At a 5% concentration of clascoterone applied twice daily, this led to a mean increase of 13.8 hairs, and at a 7.5% concentration applied twice daily, this showed the highest efficacy against placebo with a mean increase of hairs of 14.3. Even the 7.5% concentration applied once daily was effective, resulting in a 12.7 hair increase. These results confirm that all of the tested concentrations were effective. So what was strange was that after the 6-month mark, moving towards the 12-month mark, right? So between 6 months to 12 months, CB0301, clascoterone, or Breezula, whatever you want to call it, right? A decline in hair counts that went below baseline was observed. So it seemed like the results that we initially got within the first 6 months were starting to reverse, and this caused somewhat of a scare for people. People thought that at that point, clascoterone was cooked. There was no way that it was going to get to the market because it seemed to be ineffective. Now, there is an ongoing phase 3 clinical trial for clascoterone CB0301, which involves a large participant population of 726. It's a 6-month, multi-center prospective randomized double-blind vehicle-controlled study that aims to further investigate these findings. If I had to guess, I would say that perhaps on their own, topical anti-androgens aren't enough to deal with DHT or even outcompete DHT for the hair follicle's androgen receptors. Furthermore, it may be the case that this is some sort of strange temporary shedding that happens with topical anti-androgens. I want you guys to remember what we see in similar findings with finasteride during synchronized sheddings, which happens sometimes while on treatment where a big shed occurs due to the initial use of finasteride, causing the scalp DHT to suddenly reduce. And all the impacted and DHT-sensitive hairs would enter a similar growth phase at the same time. Initially, improvement is seen, but eventually these hairs go through a progressive shedding cycle, and you'll see sometimes that people go below baseline, and then they freak out and stop the treatment because they think it's not working, or they start to use, dutasteride or maybe RU58841, stronger topical anti-androgens, and riskily enough, some people even take means to completely stop their androgen production. Don't do that. But they do this because they mistaken the synchronized finasteride shedding as finasteride not working anymore. So we have that phenomenon that occurs with finasteride. Could it be the case that it occurs with topical anti-androgens? That it has some sort of weird shedding effect that occurs later down the line? I don't know, right? But I think it's still worth to investigate topical anti-androgens because an effective one could really be a nice addition to our arsenal against male pattern baldness. Now, for me, because I'm a betting man, I do think we will see clascoterone CB0301 on the market for androgenetic alopecia because, it's already there for Winlevi that has the active ingredient clascoterone to treat hormonal acne that is specifically caused by DHT or other androgen production. And androgenetic alopecia is a skin disorder just as acne is. I do think with the present evidence that there is some degree of clinical efficacy, and I'm hoping that with this phase 3 clinical study that Cosmo Pharmacy is conducting, that the results prove to be efficacious and we get clascoterone for androgenetic alopecia, as Breezula, the brand name, that it comes out sometime 2026, right? That would be very preferable. So in the future, if you're watching this and it's 2026 and beyond, this is me from the past, wishing you well, and hopefully we get this treatment or some effective topical anti-androgen treatment. Or maybe it didn't work out, and this video, in particularly this segment, has aged like spoiled milk. Or is it aged like milk, and now it's spoiled? Whatever. If you're watching this in the future, sometime in the future, comment in the comment section below, and I really hope you do this. This would probably be a nice treat for me sometime in the future. Comment, I'm here, and then the year in which you're watching, preferably the date. So for me right now, it's February 18th, 2024, 5:08 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at the time of recording this video. So maybe comment something like, I'm here January 19th, 2026, whatever your time zone is or whatever. That would be really cool to see, just for me to check on in the future. But maybe I'm talking to an imaginary audience right now, and this part is getting kind of cringe, so let me stop doing that, and let's go on to the next segment of this video. And again, I really appreciate you guys sticking with me. So let's move on to the next segment. So this is the ending of this particular video. Maybe I'll cut it up into different parts, but the full video should deal with, does testosterone grow scalp hair, or is testosterone anabolic for hair growth on the scalp? One of those titles, just that general topic. Let's proceed. And essentially, I was talking about, with the failures of topical anti-androgens, does it show that we need testosterone to some extent to stimulate the hair follicle via the androgen receptor? And the conclusion that I made was that no, I don't think that's completely necessary. And the biggest part of my argument essentially looks at the Dr. Hamilton's study on the effect of castration on the progression of male pattern baldness. You know, this is before puberty, that we had boys before puberty who were castrated, and men or adolescents after puberty who were castrated, right? You would see that the boys before puberty who were castrated, they didn't develop androgenetic alopecia. The men or adolescents after puberty who were castrated, the ones that actually had androgenetic alopecia or signs of it, it did not have any sort of progression, and in some cases, in the bald regions for those men, there was a regrowth of some hair, right? Some notable regrowth that occurred. So this shows that, is testosterone really needed for hair growth, right? This isn't to say that all the people who don't want to transition in my audience, but who also want to keep their hair, this isn't to say that, okay, you men need to cut off your balls to keep your hair. No, this is to say that if you do something like use a topical anti-androgen to block the androgen receptor such that testosterone, DHT, or pretty much any androgen cannot interact with that hair follicle via androgen receptor, that would mean that we're not going to see your hair quality diminish. Now, a good androgen receptor blocker has minimal to no transcriptional effects when it creates a complex with the androgen receptor. So I think we all know this, right? When DHT binds to the androgen receptor, it creates something called a DHT androgen receptor complex. This sort of thing, this sort of object, it goes into the cell and it interacts with DNA. And if you have the genes for androgenetic alopecia, it will activate those genes and cause the hair follicle, that particular hair follicle that the androgen receptor DHT complex has interacted with, that hair follicle will eventually miniaturize. So if whatever is blocking the androgen receptor doesn't do that, or is causing minimal transcriptional effects, then that could be a good topical anti-androgen. There are so many setbacks right now with topical anti-androgens. We don't even know if RU58841 is completely effective, and we don't even know how safe it is because we don't have the full public phase 1, phase 2 human clinical trials. We have some things that we can look at that Prostrakin has said about that, and in the case of pyrolutamide or KX826, which is being developed by Kintor Pharmaceuticals, we just saw that in its recent Chinese phase 3 clinical trial, it did not perform well against placebo. There was no statistical significance between the treatment group, being the group of participants that got KX826 pyrolutamide, versus the placebo group, the group of participants that got nothing. So for those of you who don't know, when we don't see a statistical significance between the placebo control group and the treatment group, that means the treatment probably isn't effective. And we've also seen setbacks with clascoterone, CB0301, such that it had a good 6-month result, and then suddenly, towards the 12th month result, that we saw a decline in hair counts, right? That was kind of disappointing. At the time of making this video, we have GT229, a PROTAC that is designed to dissolve or destroy completely the androgen receptor in the hair follicle. If that comes to market and it's proven as effective, that could be very, very great for pretty much everyone who's dealing with androgenetic alopecia. I could see it being an effective treatment for people who have severe so-called treatment-resistant androgenetic alopecia, and that would be to all the people who supposedly have DUPA, the diffuse unpatterned alopecia, or other severe forms such as retrograde alopecia. But I think the future is looking bright when it comes to these treatments, and if you guys haven't started already, it's probably a good idea, if you're a man, to get on finasteride or dutasteride. you know, even if it's topical or oral, or maybe some people do both. Some people do topical dutasteride, oral finasteride, oral dutasteride, oral or topical finasteride, topical dutasteride. People do a mixture of things. I like to think about it like this. You have this thing called cryonic preservation, where people, when they die, they immediately freeze their bodies and then they're put into this like aluminum tank with the hopes that in the future, with medical advancements, scientific advancements, whatever, scientists can bring them out of this frozen state of ice, reanimate them, and remove any illnesses from their body that plagued them. By using finasteride, dutasteride, and other means to prolong your hair, keep it healthy, keep it in that anagen phase, you are essentially buying time for your hair to get to a point where maybe one day, maybe in the near future, 10 years down the line, we get an even more effective treatment for androgenetic alopecia, and all those hairs that you had can be reanimated, can be strengthened. This is the idea, right? That's why you take treatment, to slow down the progression of this particular condition. If not, stop it completely, reverse it. That's why we do what we do. So this video has gone on long enough. Again, I might clip this part and make it into its own video, but the larger video that it comes from, it has gone on long enough. So I want to say thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully I've covered this topic in a somewhat entertaining kind of way. Hopefully you can understand my point that I don't think testosterone is necessary for scalp hair growth. We don't need it to such a significant extent, because if you look at the effects of castration from the Hamilton study on people that have male pattern baldness, men that have male pattern baldness, they essentially revert, their hair comes back, right? Or if they had it before puberty, if they got their balls cut off before puberty, that's a crude way of putting it, but they never developed male pattern baldness. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. I've talked long enough. I've heard my voice long enough. And thank you for being a part of this experience. All right, guys, see you in the next video. If you got this far to the video, though, comment in the comment section below, blue balls. Like blue balls, like actual blue balls, like BLUEBALLS. Funny, right? Yeah, I'm being a jokester here towards the end of the video, because it's like, you know, I'm just kind of chatty right now. I'm going to stop being chatty, though. So thanks for watching. See you on the next one. Peace out.